Patch 11.05 is here, and the dust has settled just a bit, but there's still a lot of swirling among the classes and specs. Bugs and abilities are slowly getting fixed from the train wreck of class balance in the 11.05 release, but some classes and specs have taken a major hit with this patch, while others have been boosted. Hey everyone, Two Angry Frogs here, and we are presenting our first ranged DPS tier list. So strap in, and let's get this roller coaster going. So before we get started, let's talk about our methodology. When it comes to tier lists, there are a myriad of ways to approach them. We're basing ours on a number of different weighted factors that take into account ease of play, solo and group content, single target and AoE DPS, and general utility. If we simply based it on DPS, we could just run some sims and generate a quick list, but we want to account for the different types of playstyles we engage in every day and how the classes and specs handle those in total. Unless you run a ton of Mythic Plus, most of our gameplay time is spent in solo play, and delves have amped that up even more so. For this reason, we do put heavier emphasis on how classes and specs are suited for solo play, which will make our tier list look a little bit different from your typical Raid and Mythic Plus lists. A tier list is only viable at a given point in time. With Blizzard changing their paradigm of class tuning and now adjusting classes and specs every 1 to 2 weeks, we do plan to update this periodically so it does not become stale as class balance, abilities, and utility are changed. Also, this would be a very long list and a very long video if we broke down the ranking of every range spec to their hero talent options. So our list will have a single ranking for each spec using the predominant hero talent selection. Finally, if you're a high-level Mythic Raider or you're pushing high-level keys, this list is not for you. There are tons of tier lists out there that address this particular segment of the player base, so we don't see any usefulness in repeating that data again. So with all that out of the way, let's jump in. So starting with Balanced Druid, it has received a lot of changes over the past few weeks with the release of 11.05, with both the addition of new talents and several talents being modified. The rotation itself has not changed significantly, but talent choices are a little more open now. For hero talents, the predominant choice is Keeper of the Grove, and this is especially true for newer players to the spec since it can lend itself to an easier playstyle, especially in solo play. Balanced Druid, like most specs, is not overly difficult to play, but mastering it does require getting used to the variability and rotation, depending on the enemy numbers, and making your rotation decisions quickly. DPS-wise in 11.05, it's not the greatest when it comes to single target, and sits in the bottom half of the ranged DPS pack. AoE DPS, however, is where balance shines right now. The talent changes have enabled more frequent burst windows with shorter cooldown times, so it's in a good spot right now, sitting just behind Elemental Shaman at the top. For solo players, it's a great spec for running delves. Utility-wise, druids are always in a good place, with Mark of the Wild, Stampeding Roar, a battle res self-healing, good defensive utility, and a slew of other stuns and interrupts. Balance is a great spec for survivability and overall utility. And if you need more survivability, you can always pop into bear form from time to time. So for Balanced Druid, we're putting it in the B tier. Beastmastery is one of the easiest specs to play in the game, and this is further reinforced with the pack leader hero talents being completely passive. Having all instant cast abilities and being able to move throughout our rotation also makes it an easier spec as compared to most other ranged DPS. Unfortunately for 11.05, Beastmastery was hit hard. For single target, the hit was not as significant, and as of now, we're still sitting in the top third of the ranged DPS pile. For AoE, however, we've been gutted, and are now at the bottom of all DPS specs, ranged and melee included. We've continued to see buffs to AoE abilities such as Stomp and Multi-Shot, but this has not been anywhere near enough to move Beastmastery into a viable position, and we lack any type of burst AoE, so the DPS just isn't there. When it comes to group utility, we don't bring a lot. Hunter's Mark is a decent damage boost for the raid and single target encounters, but that's about it. Utility in solo play is better, and our survivability is much improved over prior releases with 2 charges of Survival of the Fittest available, and a stun, trap, or other utility spell for just about every type of encounter. For solo play, it is by far one of the best specs, and our pets are great tanks, so solo content-wise, we have a distinct advantage with the built-in tank wherever we go. But with the nerf hammer on our AoE DPS, it's not enough to lift it up from C tier. For marksmanship, Dark Ranger hero talents were completely overhauled, and with that came quite a few bugs, so the spec has had some difficulty as of late. As with all hunter specs, Deathblow was introduced, albeit in a different form, more tied to Dark Ranger, and randomly just started hitting targets not in combat, making it extremely unreliable. But even with the rework to Dark Ranger, Sentinel is still the most popular and go-to hero talents, to the chagrin of some marksmanship players. Outside of aim shot, it's a completely mobile spec, so almost all abilities can be cast while on the run. It is a bit more difficult to pick up as compared to Beastmastery, but overall it is a relatively easy spec to play. For solo play, you can choose to use a pet, but you will take a big DPS hit if you do, so marksmanship is majority of the time a lone wolf. DPS-wise, single target is not in a good spot currently, and marksmanship sits in the bottom third of range DPS. Marksmanship has consistently had great burst damage windows for AoE, but in its current configuration, AoE DPS is also in the bottom third of range DPS specs. When it comes to DPS, there's just not a lot of good news here. And given that, it does impact our rankings when it comes to solo play, due to DPS being an important aspect of content like Delves. As with Beastmastery, marksmanship has the same group utility issues, but decent solo play utility. But the spec lacks the pets that make Beastmastery a little more viable for solo play, so for now, given all the DPS issues, we're locking it into D tier. So let's move into Mage. Arcane continued to receive quite a few changes as we hit 1105. The primary being the changes to the Spellslinger hero talents, which has brought it more in line with Sun Fury, so for the most part, you are free to pick either set of hero talents, regardless of the type of content. Spellslinger, however, is currently the most popular choice. For single target, Arcane sits in the top third of range DPS specs, and in the top third of range DPS AoE as well. So it is pretty balanced across its single target and AoE. Although like nothing compared to Hunters, Arcane does have a decent amount of mobility due to having a number of instant cast spells, such as Arcane Barrage, Arcane Orb, and Touch of the Magi. In addition, Arcane brings a good burst damage profile, so in dungeon content, it does well. From an ease of play standpoint, Arcane is not the easiest spec to master, but once you do gain proficiency in playing the spec, it can be a powerhouse in both solo and group content play. For solo play, you can absolutely grind through Tier 8 delves. Utility-wise, mages are still in a great spot. We bring sought-after raid buffs in Arcane Intellect and Time Warp, and our survivability can be really good. For Arcane Mage in 1105, we rank it as B tier. Fire Mage will surprisingly continue to be one of the poorer range DPS specs with 1105. And given that Fire Mage is one of the more difficult specs to play, that does not help from a solo play standpoint. Mobility-wise, however, this is a great spec. You can, for the most part, stay on the move during the bulk of the rotation, so that mobility helps a lot when it comes to keeping distance from enemies. For single target DPS, Fire Mage sits squarely at the bottom of the range DPS pack, but in terms of AoE, the spec sits in the top third. For burst damage, it is difficult to beat Fire Mage, and depending on the difficulty of the content, enemies will pretty much melt. However, as the difficulty gets more difficult, you may find struggles in completing content, especially when it comes to boss type enemies. As far as hero talents, it's Sun Fury, Sun Fury, Sun Fury. You can dip into Frost Mage if additional utility is required, but it will lack the damage of Sun Fury. As with mages in general, they bring a lot of utility to both groups and solo players, and defensively, Fire Mage is not in a terrible spot overall. But given the difficulty of the spec and not being rewarded with higher DPS for playing at a high level, we're putting Fire Mage in D tier for now. Once you get used to the Shatter combo and the different variations that it can occur, Frost Mage does become easier to play. However, it can take some time. Our hero talents do not significantly impact the rotation and playstyle, so once you learn the basic rotation, you pretty much have it down. Mobility, like with some other rangecaster specs, can be a constant source of spellcast interruption until you learn the enemy mechanics and how to work icy flows into the rotation. For single target, we can now confidently select either hero talent set as opposed to being tied to Spellslinger. There have been a number of buffs made to the Frostfire hero talents that have made the 2 talent tree selections a lot closer in damage. This has improved Frost Mage's output overall as compared to other ranged classes, especially for Frostfire, and for single target, we sit pretty much near the middle of the pack. For AoE, it's not as good. You could run with either set of hero talents for AoE, but currently Frost Mage sits behind both the Fire and Arcane specs for AoE DPS. For Frost Mage in 1105, we rank it as B tier. For Shadow Priest, it has seen a bit of a bump to AoE with continued buffs to Psychic Link, but the spec still needs help, and unfortunately for Shadow Priest players, patch 1105 did not bring it. However, both hero talent selections are viable in all content types, so you do have the option of going either Archon or Void Weaver, with each bringing a slightly different playstyle. Single target damage is decent, and Shadow Priest remains firmly in the middle of the ranged DPS pack, while AoE is continuing to improve with the recent buffs. Like with many other ranged DPS specs, AoE takes a bit to ramp up, so there is a lack of burst potential here. Overall, Shadow Priest is not an over-demanding spec, and once you learn the single target rotation, you pretty much have the AoE rotation down as long as you properly keep track of devouring plague targets. From a raid buff perspective, we bring invaluable utility in Power Word Fortitude, Mass Dispel, and the ever-controversial Power Infusion. And our solo play utility is good for a lot of different situations, but the continued lack of good interrupts really needs to be addressed for this class. All of this combined puts Shadow Priest in C tier. Oh, Elemental Shamans, have you ever been put through the ringer? This spec was definitely one of the most broken with bugs and issues with 1105, and class tuning has been going on back and forth ever since. First, Echo Chamber and Ascendance were fixed, which resulted in nerfs, then the changes were reverted and not nerfed, so where does it stand currently? For single target DPS, Elemental did not fare well, only being surpassed in lack of damage by Fireman. AoE, however, is a completely different story, and Elemental is a beast sitting at the top of ranged DPS specs. However, this comes at the cost of being a more difficult spec to play. There has always been some difficulty with Elemental and a lot of decision points in the rotation, and with the, for all purposes, rework of the Stormbringer hero talents, this has just been exacerbated even further. So to really take advantage of this spec involves a learning curve. As far as utility, Elemental has a ton of it. From totems to cleanses, purges, and shields, it can be a lot to keep track of. Given the complexity of the rotation and the amount of utility that you are required to use in group content, Elemental is not for the faint of heart. For solo play, it is definitely less complex as far as utility is concerned, but due to the complexity of the rotation and the lack of real single target damage, we put Elemental in C tier. For 1105, there are a couple of minor changes for Affliction, but nothing significant that has any impact on the playstyle or rotation. Hero talent-wise, Soul Harvester looks to still be the best option, but with the buffs to Wither, the Hellcaller hero spec is definitely closer now, so in solo play, you can likely go with either at this point and do just fine. For Affliction, it's pretty much mediocre single target damage, and they sit in the bottom third of ranged DPS specs. For AoE, Affliction is in better shape, sitting in the top third. One thing that does hold back the AoE damage is the reliance on spreading damage across multiple enemies, which does require some ramp-up time. Enemy packs that die quickly are a detriment to Affliction AoE damage as well. As with many other specs we have discussed, it's a mixed bag and it's difficult to find a spec that is consistent across the board, which is the case with Affliction as well. As with all Warlocks, Affliction brings on-demand utility with Hellstones, Summoning Portals, Soul Stones, and a couple of useful curses, and Warlock defensiveness is really good. For now, we rank it C tier, as even in solo play there may be some challenge due to the single target DPS issues. For Demonology in 1105, there have not been any major changes outside of a few updates to the Diabolist hero talents, which is the go-to selection for Demonology. As far as DPS, we are continuing to see improvement and positive adjustments, but it has not been enough. Although the spec does rank very high in single target at Mythic level rating, once we drop to Heroic and lower, it tends to fall off into the back half of ranged DPS specs. In AoE, as with Affliction, we require ramp-up time to really get the damage numbers going, and Demonology lacks burst AoE damage, so in group content, it lags behind a little bit. In solo play, Demonology is a lot of fun, and Tier 8 delves don't pose much of an issue. Between the tankiness of our Felguard and ourselves, survivability is really good solo. Also, as a Warlock, we have a decent amount of self-healing, and our new demonic Hellstones provide frequent on-demand heals. As with all Warlocks, Demonology brings on-demand utility with Hellstones, Summoning Portals, Soulstones, and a couple of useful curses, and survivability is really good, making it a good selection for solo play. For now, we rank it B tier. We have seen massive buffs to destruction in 1105 so far, and we're now seeing the impact of that in single target as we have moved up near the top. AoE is still lacking, and destruction sits in the bottom half of the ranged DPS, although not by much. We still rank king for cleave damage due to our Havoc ability, but that is dependent on the encounter. For hero talents, the most popular is Diabolist for single target and AoE encounters, but the margin for AoE damage between Diabolist and Hellcaller is continuing to shrink, making Hellcaller more and more viable as a selection. Destruction is a relatively easy spec to play, and with multiple pets available depending on the encounter and what is needed, it can be a great selection for open world and solo content. Our tankiness, self-heals, and general defensiveness, along with the Void Walker pet as a built-in tank, make it great for Tier 8 delves as well. As with all Warlocks, we bring on-demand utility with Hellstones, Summoning Portals, and Soulstones, so a raid team without at least one Warlock won't be seen anytime soon. With our great single target damage, respectable AoE damage, defensiveness and utility, and ease of play for solo players, we're locking destruction into A tier. For Devastation Evoker, it's not a spec I have played much to date, so there is a little guesswork here. From a raw damage output standpoint, Devastation sits in a really good spot for single target and a really bad spot, bottom third of the range DPS for AoE. So like with almost every spec we've looked at, pick your content because the spec is only going to be good at one thing. One of the big positives with Evokers is their movement and the ability to cast on the move. However, on the flip side of this is the short range of Devastation's abilities, which requires being closer to the action than is desired at times. As far as ease of play, the rotation for Devastation is pretty straightforward, and there are not a lot of decision points. So it's not overly complicated for a new player, but as with most specs, mastering them can take a little time. From a hero talent standpoint, Scale Commander is by and far the more powerful set of talents and is also the most popular choice. Utility-wise, Devastation does bring some interesting and unique abilities in Source of Magic, Zephyr, and a Dispel and Cauterizing Flame. But overall, we put Devastation right now at C tier. So as with any tier list, this is just our look at the state of the classes and specs and how we judge them. As we stated at the beginning, our tier list puts heavier weight on solo play, but it still does take into account group play in the form of raiding and Mythic Plus, so our list will differ from the typical tier list that looks at raid or Mythic Plus in a vacuum. As you may have noticed, there are some specs like Fire Mage and Affliction Warlock that I don't play very often. I know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be very proficient with the spec, which goes to show that regardless of the tier ranking, every spec is viable for solo play and open world content. But not every spec is necessarily good. There are specs that are just objectively better than others, and regardless if you're playing solo or in group content, better specs are going to give you more. Finally, we always need to take the difficulty of a spec into play as well. A given range spec may do the best AoE damage in the game, but if it is a difficult spec to play, not all players are going to be able to realize that damage. As always, let us know your thoughts and any questions you have down below in the comments. And make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you always know what's coming up next. And a special shout out to our members for your continued support. It's very much appreciated. And everyone, have a great day.